Good afternoon. My name is Linda Billings. I'm a consultant to the astrobiology program at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. We're here at the 2015 Astrobiology Science Conference. We call our meetings AbSciCons for the whole week here in Chicago, Illinois. And thanks for joining us today. We have 750 scientists from all over the world registered to participate in this conference here at the Hilton Chicago. And I'm here with a panel of 4 outstanding scientists. We're waiting for the 4th to arrive, and he will be our first speaker. So we'll hold on for a minute and hope he's delivered. And in the meantime, I'll introduce our panel of speakers. We're here to discuss astrobiology research and technology developments that are advancing the search for evidence of habitability in our solar system and beyond. And we're on the web, and we're also on NASA TV. Our briefing participants, our first speaker is just arriving on stage now, but I'll start his introduction. John Grunsfeld, Dr. John Grunsfeld, is an astronaut, an astrophysicist, and associate administrator for the Science Mission Directorate at NASA headquarters here in Washington. And he's been running around from room to room. He's been attending sessions. We're having 12-hour days here at the conference, and so he's just come from a social media gathering to join us here at the press conference. Dr. Grunsfeld previously served as Deputy Director of the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, managing the science program for the Hubble Space Telescope and the forthcoming James Webb Space Telescope. Dr. Grunsfeld graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a bachelor's degree in physics. He's a native of Chicago, so he's here in his hometown. And I bet he's going to the Cubs game tonight. Oh no, you have to go back to Washington. That's so sad. And he earned his master's in PhD in physics from the University of Chicago. He's a veteran of 5 space shuttle flights, visiting Hubble 3 times and performing 8 spacewalks. He was inducted into the Astronaut Hall of Fame this past May. And I want to mention to you that he is passionate about astrobiology, which is why he's here. He's not here in any particularly official capacity. He's here because he's passionate about the science of astrobiology. And yesterday, in his opening remarks for our conference, he called astrobiology a unifying theme in space sciences. And certainly, all of us here at AbSciCon, we're happy to hear that. Our next speaker after Dr. Grunsfeld, and each of our speakers will be talking very briefly for 5 minutes because we're on a very tight schedule here, and we want to make sure we have time for questions. Our next speaker is Alexis Templeton. Dr. Templeton is an associate professor with the Department of Geological Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she's the principal investigator for the NASA Astrobiology Institute Rock-Powered Life team. Our next speaker will be Brittany Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt is assistant professor with the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's principal investigator for the Sub-Ice Marine and Planetary Analog Ecosystems Project, known as SIMPLE, and I can guarantee you it's not simple, and co-investigator for one of the instruments that NASA just selected for development for the next mission to Europa. Our last speaker will be Vicki Meadows. Dr. Meadows is a professor of astronomy at the University of Washington and principal investigator of the NASA Astrobiology Institute Virtual Planetary Laboratory team. Our speakers today are working at the cutting edge of science and technology development in their areas of expertise. Dr. Templeton is exploring subsurface geological processes that can play a role in life. Dr. Schmidt is exploring subsurface oceans on planetary bodies for evidence of habitability. And Dr. Meadows is modeling exoplanet environments and working on how to recognize signatures of habitability and life on exoplanets. And when we get to questions and answers, we'll be taking questions here from the audience and also by email, and my colleague Leslie Mullen will be fielding email questions. And we're going to start with Dr. Grunsfeld, who's in charge not just of astrobiology at NASA, but all of space science. And as Dr. Grunsfeld has told us all, that the sciences are being unified by this theme of the search for evidence of life in the universe. Dr. Grunsfeld.
Well, I don't want to take too much time before we go to these excellent speakers, but I want to tell you a little bit about just the perspective overall for NASA science and NASA in general. Our mission is to innovate, explore, discover, and inspire. And in particular, we're all here because astrobiology fits that to a T. We innovate because life outside of Earth is probably going to be really hard to find. We can't even agree on what a definition of life detection is, and there are many sessions on trying to figure that out. And when we innovate, we develop new technology, and we apply that new technology to exploration. And that's what NASA does best, is to explore the cosmos. And when we explore, we discover things. I'm convinced that scientists and engineers and explorers have a particular expression of a gene that drives them to explore, because when we explore, we discover things, and that discovery is that wonderful act of discovering new things or discovering things that we hypothesize and confirm is one of those driving forces that has allowed humans to evolve to have the complexity that we have. And certainly the discoveries, and in particular the search for life in the universe, the search for intelligent life on Earth, that's a joke, is something that inspires, not just students, but everyone. We're trying with science to answer some fundamental questions. Where did we come from? What's the origin of the chemical elements that we're made of? The fact that our oxygen that we breathe, the iron in our blood, the calcium in our bones is all star stuff. It does come from inside of stars. What's the evolution? What's the path by which the Earth was formed with a particular chemical abundance, with the particular organics that seeded the early Earth that allowed life to form? Where are we going? What's the future history of the Earth? We're a relatively young solar system, 4.5 billion years old. There are much older solar systems out there. Where are we going? What's the future of the Earth? What's the future of the Earth's climate? What's our role in that future? Of course, it's significant. Life has always changed the Earth from when it started. It's changed the geology. It's changed the climate. It's changed what we look like from a great distance, and that's something Vicki will talk about. So if there is life out there, intelligent life, looking at Earth, they'll know we're here. We put atmospheric signatures in that guarantee that somebody with a large telescope 20 light years away could detect us. And are we alone? Is there another civilization out there? Is there any other life out there? Now, the fact that we're here and life is so complex on Earth, and that we see extremophile life, deep inside of rocks that can survive on just a tiny bit of chemical energy or in other extreme environments, to me is convincing that very high probability there's life elsewhere, and NASA science is looking for that. We're looking for it on Mars. We've just started a mission to Europa that will look for evidence of life in a subsurface ocean, and that's part of our astrobiology portfolio. And all of these things, our Earth science, our heliophysics, the impact of the sun on the Earth and the rest of the planets, other suns on their planets, planetary science, of course, and astrophysics, which has our exoplanet investigation program, all of those are really oriented at answering those big questions. And for me, it's that one of are we alone that's the biggest driving question. So with that, I'll hand it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Grunsfeld. It's a great introduction to our panel discussion. We'll turn over the mic to Dr. Templeton at this point.
Well, thank you, and I'm thrilled to be here at AppSciCon and thrilled to be here in this session today as well, because this is a wonderful opportunity for discussing changes in our understanding of habitable environments that exist on our planet, on Earth, and how that informs our search for habitable environments elsewhere in our solar system and beyond. And that's some of the theme of discussion for today. And I am part of a new team, a NASA Astrobiology Institute team that is called Rock Powered Life. So we're at the inception of a 5-year project, but we are part of a very large international community that's quite interested in the capability of rocks to store energy within them that can be used to power biological systems. And essentially there's a fundamental understanding that rocks have within them, depending upon their chemistry, the ability to release electrons or components that can fuel and power different systems, essentially much like fuel cells do. And one of the big questions at the moment is how we can couple the energy that's stored within rocks into biological systems. And one of the things that we know is that often to release that energy that is stored within rocks, it requires a reaction or a contact with water, another ingredient that we consider to be absolutely essential for life. And so there's a broad interest in understanding within our solar system the locations when water and rocks come into reaction or in contact with each other, and the factors that control the transfer of that energy into different carriers or molecules that could power biological systems. A great example that's quite tangible to many modern technologies is the molecule hydrogen. It's something that, again, can be produced through the reaction of rocks and water in contact with each other. We often use these now in building batteries or fuel cells to power other systems. And in particular, we know many types of biological metabolisms that can use a molecule like hydrogen or any kind of carriers of electrons to then drive many of their life activities. One of the interesting things is that in the geological studies that have occurred to date, most of them have looked for life forms that can exist in this way in areas that are geologically active, hydrothermal centers on our planet. But we're very interested in trying to look at environments that are essentially quieter and colder throughout the solar system and to understand whether or not these processes are occurring at measurable rates there and whether or not, again, they may sustain or support biological activity. So I just want to give a few tangible examples today of research that's being highlighted at AbSciCon and in many papers that are coming out in the literature at the moment. And I will put up a first slide, and that is not a first slide, so I go back. Maybe this picture's been with me and I was unaware. Okay. So the picture that I have behind me at the moment, this is one actually I took myself in January this year. I and other members of the team that I'm working with have been traveling to Oman, so these are from the deserts of Oman. And what you're looking at here are rocks that come from the mantle of the Earth, so rocks that are typically stored underneath the surface of our planet, but there are places where they're exposed at the surface through geological processes. There are many areas on the modern Earth that have small exposures of these rocks. And I wanted to highlight this one in particular because if you look in the upper picture at these mountains, this is a dry, barren landscape in Oman. We're in the desert. There's very little water, and there's very little sense that there's anything alive here in the surface environment at all. However, there are small amounts of water that do come into the contact with these rocks, infiltrate them, and are stored in the subsurface over very long periods of time. And it is the continued reaction of that water with those rocks that changes the water chemistry progressively. And we would have no indication of that if it didn't essentially get released up to the surface in various locations. So in the lower picture that's present here is an image of a small spring where water is released back to the surface after prolonged periods of being stored. And it's changed significantly in chemical character. And in particular, what's noticeable here is that you can come and find dissolved gases bubbling out, hydrogen and methane and some of these energy carriers or electron carriers that we're interested in. One of the things that's been particularly noted in the systems studied like this across the world, in the Philippines, California, Canada, here in Oman, all as good examples are on our seafloor, is that there are also waters that are very alkaline, meaning on our pH scale from 0 to 14, these waters often are up somewhere on the far end towards 12. It's a rare type of water to find on Earth, but it's noted by, it has a history of the chemical reactions that have occurred within it. And there's been many questions then about whether or not life could persist in waters in these extreme conditions. It's very challenging for life to exist in these types of waters. But work that's being highlighted, for example, in several sessions that are here that have started already this week, refer to the ability to detect life activity in these hyperalkaline waters and being sustained by these geological sources of energy of hydrogen and methane. And the DNA has been extracted and sequenced, and we're starting to understand something more about who these organisms are. But in particular, we're also able to, I'd say, for example, work that's recently been published from Ken Nielsen's lab has shown that there are organisms that can grow and study their biology that are adapted and optimized to these high pH fluids. So that's not only that they can tolerate them and eke out a living, but they're actually optimized and can function well at pHs of 11 or 12. And this is then very exciting to start to imagine that there's biological life forms that may be well adapted in the subsurface environment to being sustained by the reactions between these rocks and waters. So I'll just jump again then to another image here, which is a schematic from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. What you have in this picture here is essentially a cartoon of Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons, and looking at the concept of a rocky core surrounded by an ice shell. And there are many questions, again, about the potential ability to detect any activity on this type of a satellite. And one of the noticeable things from the Cassini mission has been the detection of plumes of particles that are ejected from the South Pole. And there's been a lot of excitement about the concept that those plumes represent the potential for liquid water that's stored underneath the ice shell. And to relate it to what I've been talking about earlier, as you can see in this cartoon, would be the contact of that water with that rocky core. And the existing papers that have been published have suggested it's a salty water that would have picked up many of those salts from reaction with those rocks. A recent paper that's come out of Chris Glein et al. In the Carnegie Institution is geochemical modeling that then has gone and shown that they infer that the pH of these waters is again in these hyperalkaline types of conditions and would indicate there had been extensive communication and interaction of those waters with the rocks in the interior of Enceladus. And now we are giving rise to a condition that, again, we're studying in the subsurface of the Earth that we confer to be potentially habitable. And this then gives us room for a conversation about discussing what are the signs of life you would try to detect when you could find fluids that are being stored beneath the surface of some of these moons. So with that, I'd like to transition to Brittany, and she'll talk a little bit further about some of the missions that are planned.
Thank you, Dr. Templeton. Now we turn to Dr. Schmidt. That is an excellent segue since Dr. Schmidt has been studying possibility of habitability in the subsurface oceans of Europa and Enceladus.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about research into icy worlds. So Alexis was talking about the Earth, and we think a lot about Mars and the search for life in the solar system. But there's a whole host of ice-rich worlds that potentially harbor subsurface oceans, and these are important places to think about in the search for life even within our own solar system. I'm showing two examples of exciting science that NASA's doing right now and science that NASA plans to do in the future that's astrobiologically relevant. So if we look at the two images behind me, we're looking at an image that's actually just been taken by the Dawn spacecraft. It's currently orbiting the largest asteroid, or the innermost dwarf planet, a place called Ceres that you may not have heard about. Ceres is about 1,000 kilometers across, roughly the size of the state of Texas, but completely spherical, unlike asteroids that you may think about. And what's interesting about Ceres is that for a long time, its shape and its low density has indicated that potentially there was ice and water below the surface. These first images, or very new images from Dawn, suggest that perhaps volatiles, maybe ice-rich, maybe salts, are being erupted near the surface, or at least making it up and showing their presence on the surface. This is the kind of synergy from older missions like Hubble Space Telescope, like the Herschel Space Telescope, that told us these places were interesting, and we could use our scientific understanding of these places to prepare missions like Dawn to go out there and do that exploration. So that picture that I'm showing is really a culmination of an entire industry's worth of work to try to explore a new place that we'd never really thought about before. So Ceres is very exciting, and that's what we're doing right now to highlight icy bodies. And that one's really close. Ceres is actually just between Mars and Jupiter, so much closer to us. If we move just further out, the moons of Jupiter are some of the most incredible places in terms of our search for life within our solar system, because 3 of its major moons harbor subsurface oceans. The image that I'm showing to the lower right of your screen is an image, an artist's concept of a mission to Europa, which has recently been studied and hopefully will be selected by NASA for flight to launch in 2022. currently called the Europa Multiple Flyby Mission. This mission will go back to Europa, like I said, one of the moons of Jupiter, and search for activity in the ice shell, search for the indications of a subsurface ocean that we know or we think we know is there, but actually to confirm that, and then to try to understand how this geologically active young surface is formed through interactions of the ice shell, the ocean, and perhaps a volcanically active interior just below. As Alexis was highlighting, subsurface aqueous processes in hydrothermal reactions with interiors like rocks and places like Enceladus and like Europa may be enough energy to power biology in these very distant and seemingly so alien worlds. And so I'm showing another graphic of some places that we might explore. The ice shell of Europa, where we think there's subsurface water, the ocean, which may be circulating energy between the reducing interior and the oxidizing surface. So really exciting place. So we're really very excited to be going back to Europa. Personally, I'm thrilled to be a part of the mission team. I've helped on studies for a while, and it's just been a large group of people that have been working for the past 20 years to get this mission going. I'm personally on the radar team. The instrument's called REASON, which is an ice-penetrating radar led by Don Blankenship of the University of Texas. And the great thing about this is that we may actually be able to, using ice-penetrating radar that we've used to explore the Earth, actually be able to image these processes for the first time in the subsurface within the ice shell of Europa, finally answering that question, where's the water and where do we land? So moving forward, I'd like to move to the next slide and show you what we're doing in the meantime as we wait for this mission to get off the ground. It turns out that Europa may seem alien to you and I, but if we go to the Earth's poles, it doesn't seem so far-fetched. So what I'm showing you here is a NASA astrobiology funded program through the Astrobiology Science and Technology for Exploring Planets program. It's called SIMPLE. It's an ironic name because it's far from simple. The Sub-Ice Marine and Planetary Analog Ecosystems Project, which I'm very, very pleased to be the lead, working with a great team of individuals from the institutions that are highlighted here on this slide. And one of the cool things about this project is that, as Dr. Grunsfeld mentioned, one of the amazing opportunities in NASA is to look at the synergy between technology and science. And this program does exactly that. So what we've done here is to actually work with a number of different vehicles, a number of different remote sensing and in situ sensing platforms in order to study our ocean the same way we want to study the ocean of Europa or the ocean of Enceladus. In the upper images, I'm showing images from this field season, this past field season in Antarctica. We work at the McMurdo Ice Shelf. NSF is gladly hosting us in their main station in Antarctica. And in the McMurdo Ice Shelf, these are images of a vehicle that we've built at Georgia Tech called IceFin, being deployed on the right side of the screen. That's the vehicle about to be deployed through the McMurdo Ice Shelf, so tens of meters of ice to explore the ocean below. On the left-hand side, you're seeing an image of the vehicle below the sea ice, just for some perspective of it doing its work. Just below that, there's a small diagram of Deep Skinny, which was an instrument that was also funded under the SIMPLE project. Just this year, went out with the NASA or with the NSF Wizard program and was the first to see small fish swimming out at 200 or 300 kilometers from the front of the ocean underneath this permanent ice cover. Some of that work is very synergistic with the types of science we'd like to be able to do at Europa one day. At the very bottom of the slide, I'm showing an image of Artemis, which is a large AUV that we are going to be deploying this field season, so beginning in August, also at McMurdo Station, where we're going to do long-range exploration under the ice shelf. So this has been a really long-term project with a number of individuals and institutions. I wanted to highlight that the reason that we're doing this is actually, funny I should say reason, is actually to help reason out the instrument I just talked about that's flying to Europa. So you'll notice that there's a picture of a plane in here. That's a Basler converted DC-3 aircraft flown by the University of Texas and the National Science Foundation. And this is doing ice-penetrating radar studies of the ice shelves of the Antarctic, and those are perfect analogs for the processes that one day we'll be imaging with ice-penetrating radar on Europa. So taking you to an exotic place, and I think we're going to go a little further out, and I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Meadows.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Very, very interesting. Now we go beyond the solar system with Dr. Meadows.
Thank you. Okay, so today, following on from what Brittany's talked about, I'm going to talk about studying another planet in our solar system, one that's very familiar to you, the Earth, and how we're using studies of the Earth to try and understand what we should look for when we look at extrasolar planets and try to determine whether they're able to support life or have life on them. And so the first piece of research I'd like to highlight is led by a member of my team, Ty Robinson, and it essentially is the first observational test of a technique that we one day hope to be able to use to characterize extrasolar planets around other stars to search for signs of liquid water ocean. This technique uses something called the glint effect, and that's something that should be very familiar to you. If you've ever sat on a beach at sunrise or sunset, you know that path of light that connects you and our star, the sun, that is the glint. On a larger scale, if you look at the Earth as a globe, you also see the glint on the Earth, but in that case it would look a little bit more like you had pushed a Christmas tree near the window and you were seeing a reflection of the window on one of the Christmas ornaments. That glint from our ocean on that ball that is our Earth is in fact much more detectable if you can see the Earth at crescent phase, the same way you would see a new moon. And so the technique essentially looks at the brightness of the Earth when it's near full phase and the brightness of the Earth or the exo-Earth when it's near crescent phase. And so by comparing the brightness there, we can determine whether or not the glint effect is working. So we predicted this, and we had some data that showed sort of the full Earth, but we didn't have an observation of the Earth at crescent phase to be able to validate the technique. So in this paper, we were able to use data from the LCROSS mission, which you may remember ended spectacularly by crashing into the moon in search of water in the lunar crust. But that mission, before it collided with the moon, bounced around the inner, between the Earth and the moon, and got us pictures of the Earth. And this is one of them up here. And I think it's interesting that Brittany is so excited about her high-resolution image of Sirius, and I'm so excited about this blurry image of the Earth. Because you can imagine that this is, you know, a distant Earth, something we're trying to discover and understand. And I think you can see from this image very clearly that it's not a smooth crescent. There's a ball in there that is from the glint from our ocean. So you are actually detecting an ocean on a distant planet by looking at that image. And so by comparing our models and that data, we were able to confirm that, in fact, our models are accurate. So we have more confidence now about predicting the type of signals we might be able to detect for extrasolar planets when we go for the gold and try and actually detect an ocean on another planet. The other area of research I'd like to highlight from my team, the Virtual Planetary Laboratory, is in the area of looking at oxygen as a biosignature. So many of you probably heard that we have abundant oxygen in our atmosphere because of our photosynthetic biosphere. So lots of tiny little microbes over billions of years, and our modern day and more recent vegetation have worked to build up a very large fraction of oxygen in our atmosphere, just over 20%. And we like this as a biosignature because it's a large change to our environment, which is something that we're looking for in a very distant world. We need a large change or we weren't detected. And secondly, we were pretty confident that we couldn't think of any other way to build up large amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. But my team in the last year or so has come up with 4 separate ways in which a planet interacting with its star in particular, or based on its actual intrinsic composition, may be able to build up oxygen in its atmosphere. And so these techniques involve the way that ultraviolet radiation from the star interacts with molecules in the atmosphere, or even the catastrophic loss of an ocean and water early on in the planet's life that helps to build up oxygen in the atmosphere. And this is research being led by Robin Wordsworth, by Peter Gao, by Rodrigo Luger, and by Sean Donegal-Goldman. And so what's interesting about this is you might think I'm really depressed about this news, but actually I'm very excited because we now are getting a much more mature view of what we should be looking for and what might fool us. And so this knowledge, I like to say forewarned is forearmed, now we know in particular which targets we should choose preferentially that will help us avoid these potential false positives for life, and also what other things in the planetary spectrum we should look for that might in fact help us figure out what's going on. And so this diagram here is just showing that it's not enough to just detect the oxygen in a planetary atmosphere. Now we know we have to go after other gases. For example, if we see methane, that increases our confidence that the oxygen comes for life. But if we see carbon monoxide, that decreases our confidence that the oxygen comes for life. So we're now getting to the point where we can start to figure out exactly what measurements we want to make when we have these fantastic large telescopes that will allow us to study the environments of extrasolar planets. And so just summing up, I think what you've seen here today in the work of Alexis and Brittany and my team as well, is that we are combining knowledge and expertise from many different disciplines, bringing all of that knowledge and expertise together to address very, very large questions that we couldn't address otherwise. And that is the core of astrobiology, is to bring all those disciplines together and work together to address the question of the search for life beyond the Earth.
Thank you, Dr. Meadows, for that terrific summation of what we're all doing here this week, and thank you all for your remarks. I'm going to start by taking a couple questions from the media in the audience, and then we'll go to questions by email from media participating virtually. We already received a question by email yesterday, so that one will come up first in the queue. My colleague Leslie Mullen is going to use the mic in the back to read questions submitted by email. But we'll start here, and I would ask my colleagues in the astrobiology community to save their questions for their colleagues up here on the panel for after the press conference, because we're on a really tight schedule to finish up at 1:45. Are there questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Callie Cofield with Space.com. I think in the past couple of months, especially as the Europa mission's getting going, there have been some very informed people making some big predictions about when we might find signs of life, but I think that's multi-decades away. So can each of you talk about maybe some more realistic goals that you're hoping to achieve, even just in the next decade, perhaps before some of these missions launch, in the search for life, things that we can look forward to on a slightly smaller time scale?
I'll take a quick start at that, which is that, again, staying on the Earth-based systems for a moment before we go beyond, would be that there's an enormous amount of activity internationally for drilling into the deeper subsurface of our Earth to look for signs of life and to demonstrate activity in the systems that we think do have great relevance within our solar system. And so I think that, that this will be an excellent connection to what are some of the targets within these missions in the search for life. So I think as we validate some of our hypotheses and theories at the moment, that will connect well.
I was going to comment that one of the themes of the conference here this week is habitability, right? That's the overarching theme. And in fact, that's what we're trying to do with this next mission to Europa. The first thing you do is you go and explore and you get answers, you get the basic information that you need to make hypotheses. Well, we have those now. And so what we're trying to do now is to advance our understanding of the system, the whole planet, not just an individual terrain or one part of the system, but everything, and how it cycles, how it couples, how those processes are active. And so there's kind of a synergy between all of the instruments that are planned for that Europa flyby mission. And so there's kind of, there's a graphic that you can look for, and it's kind of a triangle that shows the three pillars that are really the focus of that mission. One is water, one is chemistry, and one is energy. And those are the three things that we think about on a planetary scale that we can actually quantify. How many chemicals of what kind are on the surface? How does the ice shell recirculate? Is it bringing material up and down, which we can image with the radar? So we've got a spectrometer to find chemicals. We've got a radar to find activity in the ice shell. We have plume instruments to potentially detect higher order hydrocarbons or larger chain instruments. We have a magnetic field and plasma instruments to try to detect more detailed information about the ocean. So to me, the next milestone is to connect those things and figure out, now that we know those things about the system, about the planet itself, where do we go that's the perfect place to ask those next questions, which is it there?
Well, let me address kind of an ensemble, because Europa is certainly part of that. You know, in the solar system, we have quite a lot going on, and also in astrophysics, looking beyond our solar system. In 2017, we're going to launch the Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. It's very much like Kepler, and that's going to identify these transiting exoplanets where the planet blocks a little bit of the sunlight. But instead of looking at a very distant part of our galaxy, which is what Kepler did, it's going to look at all our nearest neighbors. So we're going to find out where all the nearest exoplanets are around our own solar system, and specifically to look for rocky exoplanets. So we're going to have a catalog of Earths, super-Earths, around the nearest stars. Because they're on the nearest stars, they're close, and it will allow us to do a better job at looking at their exoplanet atmospheres through transit spectroscopy, or with the James Webb Space Telescope, if they're close enough, by direct imaging, which might allow us to see glint and get a spectrum of the atmosphere. And of course, in 2018, October, we're going to launch the James Webb Space Telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope is a wonderful telescope. In fact, if we wanted to design an astrobiology explorer in the infrared, we would design the James Webb Space Telescope, even though when it was conceived, we only knew about 9 planets in the universe that was then demoted to 8, and now we know about thousands. So the James Webb Space Telescope is going to be able to study the atmospheres of many, many exoplanets, get relatively high-resolution spectra in the mid-infrared, and hopefully look and see for water vapor and carbon dioxide and methane, and allow us to start decomposing what these rocky planets might look like. Of course, Mars 2020 follows that by just a couple of years, which is an astrobiology explorer. It has a wonderful suite of instruments, and it's going to take core samples in relevant astrobiological context to try and find spots that, like the Curiosity rover, are places that we know are habitable. And then the question is, get those samples back to Earth at some point to see whether Mars, once had ancient life. Certainly the Europa mission, we want to get started. We are getting started with the mission. We want to launch it as soon as we can. It has a wonderful suite of instruments, and we're not done yet. We want to add, some other capabilities to the overall mission to try and perhaps even answer the question of is there life on Europa. Even before all of that, 2016, we launched the OSIRIS-REx mission, which is going to go out to a 500-meter carbonaceous asteroid called Bennu. It's going to characterize it down to very fine scale, both spectroscopically, the minerals, the characteristics, image it, and then do a quick touch and go and grab samples, up to 2 kilograms of samples, and motor that back to Earth. We know that there's lots of organic compounds. We want to be able to study those in great detail in the best laboratories on Earth. To answer one of the fundamental questions, or at least to give us some leverages, did asteroids like Bennu seed the Earth with the organics that were then that then helped enable the start of life? And so that's just some of the missions that are much more near term than Europa, but I consider Europa being launched in the early 2020s as pretty near term as well.
Can I follow on? Sorry, can I follow on just specifically for extrasolar planets? So I think, in the search for life in the next 10 years, our best chance to start that search, as Dr. Grunsfeld pointed out, we're going to definitely get good targets from TESS and potentially K2 as well. But JWST, for habitable zone planets, it's going to be very challenging for it to get spectra, but I'm pretty sure we're going to try anyway. And one of the things that, in particular, my team's been looking at is we always think, again, about looking for oxygen, but we've also done some research on something called the oxygen dimer, which is when 2 oxygen molecules sort of pass in the night and very briefly form an O4 molecule. So that type of absorption from that type of molecule might actually be something we could potentially go after with JWST, but it is a really long shot. We would have to have exactly the right target, be able to observe pretty much every single possible opportunity to observe that target. So I think JWST is our first chance to start the search, but I wouldn't hold your breath that we'll be successful there.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the media in the audience? If not, and I should also mention that any questions submitted by email that we can't address by 1:45, my colleagues and I will attempt to direct them to the appropriate people, so you can get your answers, if not before 1:45, sometime after that. I'm going to read the first question we received by email yesterday from Keith Cowing, directed to Dr. Grunsfeld. Given the similarities between both present-day and past Martian environments to environmental conditions existing on present-day Earth where life can be found, why has NASA not sent instruments to the surface of Mars to look for possible evidence of extant life?
So there's a couple of reasons why we haven't. Well, the Curiosity rover was designed to look for habitability, and we know that the surface of Mars is bathed in ultraviolet light, it's bathed in radiation, Mars's magnetic field is essentially gone, and so the theory has been that the surface of Mars is essentially sterilized. Now there are places we could go on Mars that are much more interesting for the possibility of extant life, where there's current surface water, for instance, in places where there's currently frozen water on the surface, and at those margins, there's also subsurface water. We believe there's large subsurface glaciers, or to places like the lineae on the edges of craters where we see salty water, perhaps salty water seeping out. Those are the most likely places we might see evidence of extant life if it's there. Those are challenging places to get to, the crater walls. We don't quite have the technology to do that yet, but also the belief that if there is life, it's probably has to be subsurface. Even the preservation of organics on the surface, if the surface is exposed for more than about 50 million years, we believe that the cosmic radiation in combination with the perchlorates probably has broken up the organics such that even that's not detectable if there's ancient life and the organics were preserved. So it's a very challenging environment. I think as we get more capable, the ExoMars 2018 lander will have a deeper drill than we've ever sent to Mars before, so that we can start getting below the zone, which is really a couple of meters where radiation would kill any extant life. I think then we're going to start moving more forward towards what kind of extant life detection we might have. Now that said, Curiosity did see a transient methane signal as it was driving along, which was many times over the background, which could be abiotic or it could be biotic. And so I think it's a very exciting possibility, and I anticipate that on future missions we're going to look more towards what kind of instruments could detect life. And that's one of the great themes of this conference is, what would that detection look like? Because we can't assume that it's going to be life just like Earth. So a DNA sequencer, for instance, might fail miserably even if it was surrounded by extant Martian life.
Leslie, do we have a question from email? No questions? Do we have another question here in the audience?
John Doty, I'm here with NASA Social. Somebody on Twitter wants to know, it's LR1. I think they're talking about the bright spots on Ceres, the infamous bright spots. They want to know if there's any possibility of ice or maybe a new compound or mineral to be found on Ceres. Your opinions on that?
Sure, I mean, this is work that's ongoing. So we've just finally reached what's called survey orbit. So we have several phases of mapping orbits with Dawn. So one of the things that's interesting is that, in cameras that we have and then we hold on Earth, we can just zoom in. All right, you have a changing focal length on your camera. Well, on this spacecraft, we don't have a changing focal length. So our resolution is a function of the altitude above the surface that we're currently flying at. So we're in our first orbit called Survey. We'll go down then to high altitude and then low altitude mapping orbits. And so the answer to the question is we don't know yet. It's a really good indication that something's there. There was Herschel Space Telescope indications that these areas had water vapor near them. We don't have a direct confirmation, and the science team is working very hard. These are new data. This is the other thing, is it takes a little while to get all of the data down and to work on it. But it's really exciting because it's something we maybe imagined could be there, but not exactly the way it presents itself. That's always the exciting part of space exploration, is that you put these hypotheses forward and maybe you get pretty close, but there's always something a little bit different that throws a wrench into the plans. So it's currently under work by the Dawn team. So that's a whole international collaboration, NASA and ESA, several different partner organizations. So those teams are working on it. So it's one of the leading candidates for what's there. People have talked a lot about salts in the past, have talked about hydrated minerals, I've talked about ice, we've talked about those types of things. So I think the answer is stay tuned, because we like to have those kinds of results ready for prime time. So.
Great, and that's going to have to be our last question. We need to wrap up because the working astrobiologists here need to come back into this room to continue their work. And I'm just going to echo Dr. Schmidt's message, stay tuned, because there's always something new going on. Thank you all for listening, and come back next time.